everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow's Friday, parashat Kidoshim. We are, a portion ahead of those outside of Israel because we do one day of Passover. So last week we already read Acharei Mot, but anyway, they're connected and you'll catch up with us eventually, those who are hearing this outside of Israel. Anyway, parashat Kidoshim is a portion which deals with holiness. Holiness, the Rambam, we're all familiar with his great work called Mishneh Torah. He writes in the introduction that I am calling my fifth book. The Rambam divided his Mishneh Torah into 14 different books. And he called the fifth book, he called the Book of Holiness. And the Rambam writes that this is called the Book of Holiness because I am going to, within this particular book, I'm going to talk about the laws of sexual prohibitions and prohibitions of what we put into our mouths, of food prohibitions, dietary laws. And it's interesting that those two things, Rav Drukman taught something very interesting, that we wouldn't expect that the title of a book that deals with the sexual offenses and things we put in our mouth, very earthly things, being called the Book of Holiness. But the Rambam says precisely this is what I'm calling the Book of Holiness, because it is those issues that make Israel very special. What we put in our mouths, we have very unique dietary laws. We have very unique laws regarding to who are allowed to marry, etc. Not only the sexual prohibitions, but also who you're allowed to have married with. It goes together. Those who are learning now Yivamot in the Daf Yomi know how intricate those laws are, etc. So the Rambam says this is precisely where holiness is all about, how we live our lives. And we have the carefulness that we have to be as a people of Israel that separates us, who we are. Very, very strict laws regarding those earthly, the most earthly things that there are, and that we have to abide by. And it's interesting that parashat Kidoshim, this week's portion, is called Kidoshim. Of course, after the verse, you shall be holy because I am the Lord your God holy, but of course it's connected. Holiness, if we look in this week's portion, it's a continuation of last week's portion, which dealt with, besides the laws of Yom Kippur, but it spoke about the laws of sexual offenses, where this week's portion continues and tells the punishments for those offenses. So it has a lot to do with our holiness. Besides, there are additional dietary laws mentioned in this week's portion as well. But anyway, I want to focus today particularly on a verse that's brought down in chapter 19, Leviticus Verse 18, which says, the end of the verse, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you must love your neighbor as yourself, because I am the Lord your God. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Well, we all know that the basic understanding, of course, which is a simple understanding of the verse, which is so true, we have to reach out to our neighbor, and when we see his pain, we have to feel that pain and try to help as much as we can. To leave, the most difficult challenge for any person is to leave his 4 cubits of egoism and to think about the other person. If the world was involved in this concept, we wouldn't have the terrible wars that we're facing now and all the struggles and all the terrible things that this world is going through. If we go by that golden rule, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you must love your neighbor as yourself. And this is what this is what Rabbi Akiva says. This is a great klal b'Torah, klal gadol b'Torah, a great rule of the Torah. In order to understand what is Rabbi Akiva saying about this is a great klal b'Torah, I want to remind us of the famous story in the tractate of Shabbat, brought down on page 31. And there the Talmud brings down a story of a non-Jew who went over to Beit Shammai. He went over to Shammai. Shammai is one of the great masters of the times of the Mishnah, even before the Tanaim. It's called the Zugot. And he asked Beit Shammai, please convert me and teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. And what does Beit Shammai do? Beit Shammai pushes him with a rule or some kind of measuring tool of a building. He didn't have patience. As we all know, Beit Shammai was strict in his personality. He felt maybe he was making fun or whatever it was. Leave me alone. He goes to Beit Hillel, and Beit Hillel agreed to convert this non-Jew. And he told him, you want it on one foot, so I'll tell you it on one foot. De'alecha saneh lechavrach lo tavi. What you hate, what you don't want to be done to you, don't do to your friend. That is the entire Torah. And every other part of the Torah is an explanation and expounding on this fact. Zil Gemor, go ahead and study. So this is really how the reaction. Of course, before we have to first analyze a little bit this Talmudic portion. Obviously, Beit Shammai. Why does the Talmud stress that this ruler that he pushed away the Gentile from converting with their request of teaching Torah on one foot with a ruler? What does it mean, the rule of a building? Beit Shammai, and this I'm explaining in the name of the Kli Yakal, the famous commentary, because we know that a building, in order to build a building, you have to have a strong foundation. You have to have pillars, foundations that hold the building up. You need a few good pillars that hold that building up. You pour the floor, have foundations. So Beit Shammai basically was saying to the Gentile, he was saying, listen, you want one foundation of the building of the entire Torah? There's not one foundation. I can't give you one of those things. Get out of here, On the other hand, Beit Hillel was thinking a different direction, because the non-Jew was looking, again, for someone who didn't grow up as a child as studying Torah. He was looking for something that can really hold on to and be a guide for him for his new journey later on in life when he decided to convert. So Beit Hillel said, something, I'm going to, he told him the foundation you must love your neighbor as yourself. But he said it in an interesting way. He said it, what you do not want to be done to yourself shouldn't be done, to your neighbor. But he said that's the entire Torah. How we relate to one another. And he said everything else is an explanation of this, and go out and study. So Beit Hillel found an interesting foundation that he felt that this could be a major lighthouse for that Gentile who now is converting, and this will help him maintain his studies and grow in Torah, just focusing on that his whole life, reaching out to your neighbor. Fascinating story in the Talmud. The Kli Yakal goes on to say something interesting. He says the Talmud brings down in Makot, another tractate, that in the name of Chavakuk, one of the prophets, that the entire foundation of the Torah says Tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh, a righteous person will live on faith. Means the foundation of the Torah is faith. We must have faith in God. And he said, but it's not a contradiction, because there are really two sides here. And both sides, he says, are reflected within the verse. What are the two sides? The first side, as we said, loving your neighbor as yourself, right? In the verse. But the other side, which Rabbi Akiva, the first side, Rabbi Akiva calls the great rule of Torah. The other one, he's saying, refers to faith. But there are two aspects we know in Judaism, that there are laws. If we look at the Ten Commandments, we see there are laws relating to God and man. Right? You must not have any other gods, etc. Right? There are laws. We all know the first side of the tablets were the laws Bein Adam Lamakom, between God and man, like keeping my Shabbat, etc. The other side of the tablets was laws between man and man. So there are really two sides. Bringing that verse down, you must love your neighbor as yourself, in reality contains those two aspects. On the one hand, we have to fulfill the laws relating from man and man, reach out to our neighbor, worry about the needy, etc. On the other hand, we have to have faith in Hashem, which is reflected by the last two words of that verse, in Leviticus 19, verse 18, where it says, Ani Hashem, I am God. Love your neighbor as yourself, I am God. Love your neighbor as yourself, but remember that I am God. So also have that faith in Hashem. We have to combine both worlds, and he brings down a beautiful example of the Kruvim, the cherubs in the temple. Their wings were facing the heavens. In other words, they were reflecting on the need to have that connection to Hashem, right? That the faith in Hashem. On the other hand, they were facing one another as friends, facing one another, which showed the love that one must have for the other individual, from between man. This concept is really the basis of the entire Torah. The laws that between man and the laws between man and God. That faith, we bring it all together, and that is how we build our holy lives of being holy people of Israel. God commands us for having those focused on those two directions. Today, and it's very, very important to mention as this important topic as we speak about this holiness, right, which requires the way we behave, of course. And we can say they're the same things reflected too in those holiness. One, how we behave with our fellow people, of course, how we behave sexually, who we're allowed to marry. That has to do with man, between man and man, right? How we relate. The other way, what we put in our mouths. God is telling us, limiting us what we're allowed to eat, right? So that also is reflecting the two sides, the two sides of our relationship with Hashem and our relationship with man. Of course, within those laws, each law, when a person commits something which he's hurting a fellow human being, at the same time, he's transgressing against a human being and God, right? Because it's important to stress that fact. But it's really fascinating, of course, how those two aspects are always behind the scenes, and that's really what we have to realize. That's the basics of our faith as being Jews. And of course, this is something that expands to all of humanity. Everyone has to rectify those areas on their different levels. Just that Israel has its unique concept of where we are all responsible for one another. Kol Yisrael arivim zeh lezeh. And what does it mean? Because here it's brought down in a very fascinating teaching of the Aliyah Kadosh says if a person doesn't fulfill the commandments in this world, 613 commandments from the Torah and then 7 commandments from the rabbis, he's going to have to come back in a future Gilgul reincarnation to fulfill that. And the question is, how is it possible we can fulfill all the commandments? The only way to do it, in reality, is loving your neighbor as yourself, because we're all as one nation together fulfilling all those commandments. We can't do it alone. We can't build a temple alone. And today we can't build. If we're not building a temple, we have to study about it. So someone's an expert in this area of Torah, and the other one's an expert in this area of Torah. We are blessing one another through that, sharing the Torah with one another, and basically sharing our commandments that we've done with other people is a powerful concept of the arivut of Kol Yisrael. Has to do with V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The non-Jew coming from the outside, he was now actually having to enter this whole new picture of life and understanding, because in non-Jewish world, people are judged individually. It's a different, totally different concept. Israel is a different creation. Israel is a creation where we are created as a nation, having to fulfill the Torah as a nation together, living in one land. That's why we're so obsessed with our land and our temple, because this is where we can fulfill the Torah as the people of Israel. But other people in the world don't have that responsibility. They could do their thing where they are. We must live in the land of Israel. We have to work together as a nation. So this whole concept of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is manifested in that self, and that helping us all together fulfill the Torah in that way. I heard a very interesting quote from Rav Metzger, which I've heard, I think, in other places as well, that I've seen, that it's something that's fascinating. That if we look at the tractate, when it says, teach me the entire Torah, I'm standing on one foot. What does it mean on one foot? It could also mean, in Hebrew, the word regel echad. A regel in Hebrew could also mean one time. In other words, when a person doesn't fulfill the Torah, he has to come back again in another reincarnation to do the Torah again. And it's very painful. We all know that someone to be reincarnated, it's very, very, for the soul, it's a very, very difficult thing. A person wants to do it once and do it right. So he's saying, the non-Jew was saying, I'm becoming part of Israel now, and I want to do it right. Tell me what to do it right. I don't have to come back again. Regel echad, on one foot. So Hillel was saying, this is the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You must realize that if you love your neighbor as yourself, and we all fulfill commandments together, and we all rely on one another, we're helping our fellow, a fellow Jew, studying Torah, learning together. We're gonna all be here once. We're not going to have to come back again, and that's part of the responsibility of Kol Yisrael arivim zeh lezeh, right? Which is, and therefore, if we follow the rest of the Talmud, he's saying, what you hate, don't do to your friend. Zoi kol haTorah kol. That's the entire Torah. V'idach perusha zil gemor. Right? That's the entire understanding. In other words, if you love your friend as yourself, and we are going to realize that we are fulfilling part of the commandments, he's getting the benefit of that. And zil gemor, what you can't fulfill today, go learn. That's what he's saying. Zil gemor refers to rabbis say, what about nowadays? We can't do everything, right? We can't, we can't fulfill all those sacrifices. A lot of things don't apply it today until we rebuild our temple. So rabbis say, gemor is the answer. Go study. If we study about the temple, we study about those different things that we can't apply today, we are like fulfilling them. So we get, by learning them in the Torah, we're actually fulfilling those things. Anyway, so that's like an interesting drash, like a Hasidic explanation of this concept of what it means. Kol Yisrael Arivim Zeh Lezeh, all of Israel is responsible, and how V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, this concept was being taught by Hillel to that new fresh convert. This is really what it's all about, realizing our responsibility for one another. I saw the Chatam Sofer, one of the great rabbis, and he brings down that this concept, a lot of times people are great Torah teachers, the great Torah scholars, but they have to realize that what does it mean to love your friend as yourself? He says, sometimes when a person has to go ahead and teach someone else, and it may take away from his own personal study time, right? But what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? To take out your time and teach that person, right? Although at that particular time, he's not going to feel he's doing the same level of understanding he has, but he's taking out his time to teach someone else, and that really is the fulfillment as well of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And that's really what, again, this important concept of the non-Jew was coming in, and he was asking, and Hillel took out his time. He told him, no, that this is the basic fabric of the entire Torah. Don't do to what you wouldn't want to your friend. And he was preparing him to realize that responsibility we have for one another. And of course, someone coming from the outside needs a lot of time. And that whole concept, what is L'havta l'reacha kamocha, is to reach out. So please be an example. Reach out to the one who's turning to you, and you have to be there for him. So anyway, this is another explanation of that. I just mentioned what I just started talking about a couple of minutes ago, was that now, today, more than ever, we're in a situation where the world is in dire need of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The entire world is suffering terribly with all kinds of, look what's going on in Ukraine, and you have to go far with things we've been going through, COVID, all this. It doesn't end. It just seems to be one thing after the next. We have to focus on this formula of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to reach out to our fellow brother and sister in love and feel the pain, whether, again, it's here, your neighbors that are close to you, or neighbors that are far away from you, or different countries of the world, nations of the world. Loving, we see how this whole concept, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, on one hand, we're learning a great lesson about how Israel is responsible for one another, but at the same time, how the nations of the world are turning to Israel. And the answer was given, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha was used as this concept of bridging between the nations. It shows how this is really the formula for all nations, for rectifying the entire world. I think that's a deep meaning behind this Talmudic teaching, is that all of Israel are responsible, of course, not only for themselves. Of course, we have that Arivim Zeh Lezeh, but we are responsible to be a light to the nations. And here we see within that, on one hand, we realize our special uniqueness. You must be holy, but when the nations are turning to you, we can't turn away. We can't just say, go away. We have to reach out and be there for them. So that's I think a very powerful thing, because here we can easily close up and say this is all about Israel. But no, Israel is never all about Israel. Israel has that function of being a light to the nations and reaching out to the nations and opening up our door and inviting the nations to come to us when they turn to us. We should not push them away. And this is, I think, fascinating when it talks about the end of the days. that the nation's going to come to you, to Israel, and say, we heard that God is with you, come and teach us. This is a reflection within that Talmudic teaching, I think, what's happening today. So today, the formula of what's going on in the world is this: more Torah, being a light to the nations, reaching out. And of course, Israel, as our nation, as our people, we have to be there for one another, strengthen one another, so we could work together, fulfilling our mission as Israel together, and also not forgetting our function as who we are as a people, our mission of being a light to the nations, which I always try to stress. But anyway, have a beautiful Shabbat. I hope this was clear, this message. Shabbat Shalom. We'll be in touch. Shavua Tov. We have next week, an important week coming up with Yom Ha'atzmaut, of course, before Memorial Day. So we will be in touch. Take care. Shabbat Shalom.